Welcome everybody. It is let's see, March 12th. Hard to believe it's already March. And this is episode 12. I believe we'll go with 12, maybe 13. I lost count a while back of what makes it tick. And today we're talking to a friend of mine, Doug, that is a I don't know, Doug, you've been doing this a long time. I would call you an old school guy because we're around the same age. And we're going to say old school way of doing things and knows shading or painting, depending on what side of the pond you're on. Racking, also another term I've heard. That's what my UK friends use, and I'm just kind of looked at them kind of stupid whenever they said that for a good 5 minutes before I finally understood. Oh, you want us to change the irises? Okay, so we're going to go with shading because I think that's probably the more common way of saying it here in the U.S. So we'll refer to it as that. So welcome, Doug, and thanks for coming along, and everybody else that's joined in. Hopefully, we can all learn a little bit together. Doug's got some great information, and Doug, I'll let you kind of run with it, and then we'll just say 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so. We'll jump in with some questions and see if we could stump you or stump ourselves one of the way
Oh
or
yeah, well you probably will stump me because I am old school, where I'm the person who wears many hats and have done camera and directing and utility and A2 work and everything else. And through all that and running small trucks and full-time jobs, have done a lot of shading and painting in small trucks, and then recently with RSN work for sports, locally in Pittsburgh market, professional sports have found a niche and a home in the video department. So I mostly work as a V2. That's kind of the technical term, but also as a V1. Obviously, the V1 is the lead. So I have a mentor, Diana Caputo, who's been in the business for a really long time. A couple years ago, she was probably one of the few V1s that could do 4K and HDR because she would work the Fox World Series. She was the lead for Fox World Series. So she's my mentor, and I've been learning the in and outs of being a true V1 on a 53 footer. But small truck shows and having a match cameras, multi-camera, that's something, I've been doing with for years, from, just trying to grab whites and try to mite it that way, all the way up to actually physically getting in the controls and painting the camera. So, I mean, the first thing about shading and painting is really starting with light, right? So you have to first think about what lighting environment are you in? Are you in a controlled studio, or say like a gym where you're going to have, just a single kind of set lighting? Are you outside at a baseball or football stadium where you're going to go from, day to night? You're going to go from the sun over to, the venue lighting. And when we talk about lighting, we talk about it in temperature, right? Kelvin. We've probably heard this, right? Get a white balance, 3200 Kelvin, get a 5600 Kelvin white balance. That's what we're talking about with lights. So the sun, daylight is generally thought of to be 56K, 56 Kelvin, but depending, it can, be 65, Kelvin. Interior lights, back in the day when there were the hot lights and the tungsten, they were always 32 soft white, Kelvin temperature, right? But now modern LEDs and bicolored lights, you can literally dial in your own temperatures. So when you're working in the studio, you can decide, do I want my lights? I have lights here, set to 40 Kelvin. Do I want it at 40 Kelvin or 32 Kelvin? So you have to think about, where am I setting my lights at and what am I working in? And in sports, that's tricky, specifically outdoors, right? Because you're going to start maybe a high school football game in the early stages in that bright sun. It's going to be 56K. You're going to match your colors, get a good white balance and everything. And then as that sun goes down and those venue lights take over, that color is going to change. That Kelvin temp is going to change. It's going to change from something around 56K to, a lot of venue lights are in the 40s. So, maybe 45, 48 down to 40, depending on the lights in the venue. So that's going to shift, and that's going to shift your colors, right? And that's what we call the paint down, right? So we got to paint, we got to change the colors of those cameras with the color shift that's happening, right? So the reason we do this and the way we do it is with tools like vector scopes and waveforms, okay? And so here is a VVix vector scope and waveform of my camera. The waveform is on the left, the vector scope is on the right. So the waveform is going to show you your iris, white levels in increments. You know, a good waveform's going to have a scale. That top line is 100% all the way down to, you know, 0, and then even down deeper into the blacks. The vector scope, it's in a circle. As you can see, you can see the red for red, you can see the magenta, the yellows, the blues. Now, when you are, you know, adjusting color, you want to start with the iris and the black levels first, because that will then dictate if you're doing what you're doing to the colors, right? So a face usually wants to be between 60 and 70 on a waveform monitor. You know, if you have a camcorder, you can set the zebras, you know, to like 70, so you get the zebras on your thing. So, you know, that's a good thing. Or you can set it down to 65 and adjust your iris that way. But on a waveform, generally you want the face around 60, between 60 and 70. And that's kind of where mine is. If I kind of raise my hand here, you see my hand kind of go across the screen. That's my skin bouncing back the light, and it's at the 60 and kind of 70 mark there. Now for the color, the vector scope, you see there's kind of that, there is the big blue shift, right? Because I have a lot of blue in the background, right? So you have that blue shift happening over towards the blue point, and then you have that shift up towards the red. Now, between red and yellow, you see that line kind of going straight out there. That's a reference line. If you have a good vector scope, that is a reference line for skin tone. And when you talk about painting, it's all about the skin tone. This is what we're painting for, is the skin tone. And it doesn't matter if the person is, you know, European, you know, Polish white like me, or, you know, really tan Italian, or, you know, African American, or whatever. Skin tone is always going to be basically in the same vector on the scope. Now, I will tell you, looking at this, it's a little red for my taste. If I had an RCP hooked up to this camcorder, I would niche it over more to the yellow, get it hugging up against that line. But let me show you the skin tone, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to disappear, and you're going to see that spike up to red disappear. So, see, I'm off of the camera, and now I come back. And so that's just my face. That's my skin tone creating that spike into the vector scope, right? And so that's what you want when you're painting. Now, how do you get there? Well, to get there is to have a really good vector scope. But to have a really good vector scope means you're going to need to have a lot of money. And I can, you know, and I can show that to you. So this is an old vector scope. This is an old tube, probably analog signal. That's color bars. And as you can see, the red of the color bars is hitting the red, the magenta, the blue, the yellow, the green, and the cyan. So the color bars are good, the scope is calibrated, and we're all peachy keen there. But now we look into what can we get, you know, go shopping on B&H, right? So, you know, starting at the basement level would be a Blackmagic scope duo, right? It's not bad. Us who work in big trucks call these Bluravisions, because it's kind of blurry. To tell you the truth, I really think, compared to Blackmagics, I think vMix actually has a much better. And when I would say Bluravision, if you were to see a really bad vector scope, the lines on the vector scope would be, there would be so much like noise in it that you really can't tell how it's shifting. But you know, you're starting at, you know, $800 dollars there, a little over $800. Then you have next a leader. This is a device that you would plug into a monitor. But you know, depending on what monitor you have, if you don't have a really good monitor, like a $15,000, reference monitor, that also is going to be kind of a blur vision. So you spent $9,000 for blur vision. And then that's actually that $1,000. You think, well, that's a good price, right? Well, that's just a license. So if we get down to like real scopes, you know, 2 liters right there, $7,000 and $9,000. That's not chump change, right? But those are really good scopes. So if you're working on a small thing, what can you do? vMix is a cheap, pretty software. It's not bad. The reason I like vMix's vector scope over, say, Blackmagic's is because it does have that reference line, that line between the yellow and the red that gives you a guide to where your face tones are. And it's all about your face tones, right? So how are we going to get there? So we have some tools, like if you're doing sports, this is like an impact, it folds up. It's, kind of like a bounce card, but it's actually just basically a big white balance card, so you could take this out, get like a starting point, if you don't have RCPs, and we'll get into RCPs, you can use this to kind of get a white balance. A lot of camcorders have the ability, you can dial in the temperature, dial in the Kelvin, right? I was able to dial in the Kelvin of this JVC 500, so you can take this out there and dial it in and get a good iris and, even a white balance off of it. But another great thing, sometimes it doesn't work good in sports because of the throw, is a color checker device like this here. So these can be expensive, and you got to be careful of them. You can't just like throw these around. But as you can see, it has everything on it, right? So over here, it has the different variations of skin tone. It has the different variations of white and gray, and it also have the colors. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull it up and I'm hold it, and I'm going to show you that I've realized that I need to go into the matrix of my JVC 500, because if you see that magenta is not hitting where it should be, even the greens are probably a degree off, the yellows are a degree off, and the reds are a degree off. So I white balance this camera using this, but just from this, I can tell that, and I should have showed you, I white balanced the camera off of this, but from this, I can tell that the camera is not producing the colors correctly, right? And that's normal. And that's where some people will get into trouble, right? I see this a lot with streamers with PTZ cameras, right? They go, well, I have 5 Bird Dog P200s and I got them all set to the exact same settings and I don't understand. They're all like 5 different colors. Well, that just doesn't work that way. In the big trucks, the 53-foot trucks, of Grass Valley cameras or Sony cameras, with the lens package and the RCPs, these are $200,000 cameras, and you put 2 of them next to each other and, set everything at the same levels, it's not going to look the same. It depends, that sensor, when did it come off with the sensors next to each other, the image processors in the camera, just how it's reading that sensor, the glass that is on the camera, how that glass was made, so it's impossible to get 2 exact cameras if you buy, even if they were serial number 001 and serial number 002, there's going to be a variation in that camera. So you can't just say, I have one camera and then I set all the rest, it's perfectly fine. No, it's just not going to work that way. So that's why you have.
Let me
Yeah,
interrupt real
sure.
quick. Would you say though that it's easier to match cameras that are all in the same family, say all Sony's, all Panasonic, all Grass, versus disparage just a totally, oh, I got 5 different cameras, 5 different manufacturers?
Yes, definitely so. Especially if you don't have tools like a full RCP or vector scopes, and know how to use them, right?
Sure.
Because yeah, Canons and Canons tend to be more warm in their color profiles. Sony's I think are more neutral in their color profiles. JVCs I think are a little blue and their color profiles. So yeah, depending on that sensor and that camera and how it's processing between different brands, you can you between different brands, you shoot the same white balance, you're going to get wildly different. And that's even within different models, like if you have all the same model of the same brand, you can get them close by just the white balance. But if you have a JVC 500 and a JVC PTZ and a JVC 170 and a 600, and you have three different brands of JVC cameras, you can white balance them, all the same lighting conditions, and it's going to be exactly the same. Or they're not going to be exactly the same. They're going to be wildly different. The other thing is how the light's hitting it too, right? So think of baseball, right? Baseball is kind of shot in the round, right? Which is kind of weird. It kind of goes against the 180 rule, right? Because you have the high home up above, and then you have the center field cam. They are completely opposite, right? So how that light is bouncing off that field, that is a variation. So, if your cameras are not lined up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 next to each other, one's over here and one's way over there, how that light is bouncing will also affect the color and the color temperature. So it's really impossible to set the cameras the same. You can get close, with white cards. Back in the day, I would white balance and then, kind of tweak in with Kelvin temperatures, diving into color temperature. And then if you're a streamer, you can use the proc amps. Like a lot of, systems like vMix have proc amps. So you can use the proc amps then to then do the final tweaks in your vector scope to get everything. So that's what I do with my streaming clients. So if I have my PTZs, I get a general white balance, see where it is, then I use the proc amp and vMix to get everything kind of lined up. And that's something we do in the big trucks. We have frame syncs. So frame syncs are very useful tools, but a lot of time we're using the frame syncs to bring in feeds. So maybe we're sucking in a camera from an away truck, we're sucking in house feeds, maybe we got Marshall POV cams, we're bringing those into the frame syncs, and then we're using the frame syncs and their proc amps as RCPs, right? So I probably mentioned RCPs like 5 times, and probably people are like wondering what is like an RCP, right? So here is a Sony RCP, and as you can see, it's $6,000. Nothing is cheap in the big boy levels of trucks. But when you're talking about an RCP, you're talking about a control surface, basically. So just like a control surface for a switcher or an audio mixer, this is a control surface. And so if you see my handy dandy little mouse there, this big boy here, that is the iris. So that up and down will open and close your iris. There's a wheel on the bottom, which this is an indicator. This is your black level, your master black, your PED. So you can adjust your blacks. Then you have your red, green, and blue in the whites. And then you have the red, green, and blue in the gammas. You have the ability to do shutter, change the filters, and then you can go in real deep into the menus of the camera, get into the matrices, get into the knee, which is the highlights, basically the bright stuff. If you're shooting somebody into like a reporter from the field and there's a lot of sky, you could turn the knee on or the auto, and it's just going to cut down the sky, right? Because you want that person's face at like 60 or 70, but that sky might be at 120, right? You turn on the knee on the camera, and that's going to bring down that sky to 100, and make it, technically legal. But so we use RCPs to paint. There's a lot of, third-party RCPs.
Yeah, I've
and
got
there's
a
a lot
couple
of
of them to
software.
show.
Yeah, I think you have one too, if you want to show that.
This is the RCP Pro from Scarhoy, and I've actually I like it. It's got a lot of possibilities. This is one of their later models with the new joystick, which was kind of cool that it actually display your f-stop or wherever you're at in your iris, so you don't have to guess where you are. A variable that you're here, you're here, you're here. It actually tells you where you're at in the camera. This one is interesting because it's supposed to be, I guess you would say, ambiguous to what you're using. You should be able to use it with multiple cameras. So we use it with our Panasonics. It still needs some tweaking to get 100%. One way we set it up at our last tennis event is these buttons across the top here were selectors for multiple cameras. And so we tried for a while there, we tried to go ahead and use it as the one place of source of truth, I guess you would call it. And the problem we ran into is we were chasing sun, cloud, sun, cloud, sun, cloud, and it was too fast for somebody to be able to switch cameras, change the iris, switch cameras, change the iris, switch cameras, change the iris. So the other one we have, which we just really adopted really well, is this guy. The color fly, a little bit different. It still has the buttons to select your different presets, your cameras, and it allows you to use more multiple faders. I'm trying to get it over here. My cable's a little short. Sorry. So the faders themselves are actually motorized. So if I go from different like right now, I don't have all the cameras selected, but if I go to different cameras and select them in different layers, even the motors would go back and forth to where they were. I like that also, just as kind of a, oh, it's either wide open or it's not wide open. It's easier to see before you make an adjustment where it's at. Um, it's got a lot of potential. It works really well with our UB300 cameras, which are a box camera. Our UC4000s, it did not work with well at all. It was very steppy in the iris adjustments. So we're still working on getting some of those things with Scarhoy tuned out. But I noticed that, the cost, we kind of talked about this in the very beginning, Doug, is the cost of playing is sometimes you just got to buy once, cry once. And sometimes you cry a lot because each one of the RCPs, or as they call them in the Panasonic world, are ROPs, remote operation panel. Each one of those that are from Panasonic are right about $5,000 a piece. So that's every camera needs that extra $5,000 for us. And they're at least thinking, I'm not sure about the Sony world as much, or the Grass Valley, but the Panasonic guys are thinking, and they're making ROPs that are available to be able to use with all their Panasonic line. So their newer stuff is IP based, where old school ways we were having to run our DB9s or small serial cables to each one of the CCUs. These are IP based, so they can sit anywhere on the network, which I really love that flexibility. And then also at the same time, we could actually put multiple profiles in there and they could switch between different cameras. There are times we need that. Like you were saying, if you're painting a Marshall, do you really need to go in and have access onto that instantly every single time that camera goes to air? Maybe not. It just depends what you're shooting. But yeah, that's the Scarhoy third party options that I've been using, trying to use at least.
Yeah, and those are good. They have it now so that their panels work with AJA frame syncs, and all the big trucks use AJA frame syncs. And so, like our home truck, we have to go into the web GUI to paint all those those separate feeds, which is a very labor-intensive process. I would love if we had one of those Scarhoys that we can go through the different frame syncs and adjust it, that way. So they have a benefit, for somebody who is a low end, maybe they're using camcorders or something like that. I think the Colorfly is a good option. How I personally would set up is every one of those individual faders would be an iris control for
exactly
each
how
camera.
ours are. Yeah,
Because that's the thing you're going to work out the most. Then the next thing you're going to work out is the painting. So you'd have to maybe you could have a preset that would allow you, to go through and adjust all the reds, and adjust all the blues. But you also have the encoders up there, so you could go through each individual and adjust it. And it's a lot. When you're in the paint down, when that sun starts to go down, you're constantly you're painting. And then as soon as you've painted all those cameras, you're going back and you're starting again.
Yep.
And then you're starting again. And you're
so.
starting again until those lights take over and it stabilizes.
Yeah.
So in the truck, we have limits how many cameras we can kind of paint, as a shader, so there's a V1 and a V2.
What's the average number that you're seeing your test with? What's
I usually got about 5. I usually got between 5 and 7. Our contract limit, because we're a union-based shop, is 7. So any more than 7, and these are, operated cameras, so if we had 14 operated cameras and somebody wanted to add a 15th operated camera, we would have to have a second V2 in, so like, bigger shows like Monday Night Football and stuff like that, they're going to have multiple V2s
Right.
sitting.
Right.
And it's a little weird. It's also across the pond. You talked about across the pond. So across the pond, it's a little differently. They have less people. They might shade 1 or 2. I'm told they may only ever be in control of 1 or 2 cameras. In the
Oh,
U.S., it's
wow.
very typical for
Wow.
the shader to be in charge of 5, 6, 7 cameras. And speaking of Grass Valley, we have Grass Valley in our truck, and you're right, everything's Ethernet based, Nate. The new Sonys, the RCPs, they're all Ethernet based. Grass Valley has a really good system. A lot of people know the 400 series panels, but there's a 500 series, which is called their sign panels. They are fantastic. They have touchscreens, and they're master control stations, because you can buy a master control station that
Right.
you can control all the cameras, right? It operates off of a software that runs on an iPad. And it is extremely flexible. It is beautiful. Like that's, RV1, when they got the truck, she said, you got to get the system, get the system, get the system. And it's a fantastic system. But the Grass Valley's auto irises are not good. The Sony audio irises are fantastic.
I can
And
say
you think,
Panasonic's not is
yeah,
so-so.
yeah. And
Yeah.
you think auto iris, like who uses auto iris? You're paying
There are
somebody to
times.
sit there, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to, because if you have six or 7 cameras, especially in golf, right? Because those you might be on 6 or 7 cameras, but those cameras could be doing different stuff, and that ball's going from the grass into the sky and back down, right? So a lot of shaders in golf will use that auto iris, and you can tweak it for golf. So
Right.
sometimes irises on the big cameras are used.
I found in the Panasonic, our Panasonics especially, is it's too bright to me.
Yeah,
Just if you turn it on to its normal settings, it's just too bright for me. So we finally found the settings in the UB300s, and I think Brandon found it in our 4000s also, where you could set where auto iris rides. And so ours we set about, I think, about 10% below, and then it's pretty much on a legal part at that. I don't know how they missed that. I don't know if it's just the way they set them up from the factory like that, but even all our Panasonics, exactly the same thing. They're just too bright for auto
yeah,
irons.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Now let's talk about some controls, right? Like if we're talking about the RCPs, right? It was hysterical, because when I came up in small trucks, we had smaller RCPs, not the big RCPs, right? And so you might get red and blue, and you have, like, instead of a stick, you have like a dowel, right? And I go, man, I need green, because I was doing football. I'm like, I can't get the color right. I need green. I need green. And then I got on to the big boy trucks and my mentor, and the first thing she told me, she says, "We never touch green, and we never touch the gammas." I was like, what? She's like, "We never touch green, and we never touch the gammas." And I was like, okay. And so then I kind of learned, like, yeah, you actually don't need green. You need the red, you need the blue, and then through those you can manipulate on a vector scope where you want it to go, so that you're lined up and you have the flesh tones. Or if you're doing something like hockey, is real nice because it's white, where it is, it's in the center of the vector scope, is white. So red and green is all we ever really paint. We actually have 2 robo cameras that actually we do have to adjust the gammas, because there's a really red shift in the black gammas. And we do pull a little green out of that one, because there's just that camera and how it processes is a little weird. But generally you only need red and blue. So if you have a small thing, or you're setting up your controller, like the ColorFly, you don't worry about the green. You really only need red and blue for when you're coloring.
Mm.
Um, and so you always want to get the iris first. You want to get your black levels first, and then you start painting your red and your blues. Um,
Sounds simple.
and
It's so
yeah,
simple.
yeah,
That's
it's so
all it is.
simple. Anybody could do it. Um, you know, the next thing to think about is having a good monitor to view on, right? you
Mm.
know. So you know, if you a scope, if you know how to use a scope and you can use a scope, it's great, you know. But a lot of people, you know, streamers and stuff like that, they don't know how to it because you kind of got to be
You mean
taught,
a
right?
TV monitor, right? So
Yeah,
any
so you
TV
just,
works.
yeah, just any TV monitor will work, but that's not the true. We like back in video in the big trucks, we have reference monitors. They're $20,000 monitors on their own, so they're calibrated. So if you're using a computer monitor, stuff like that. But what I would say, because that's most, you know, people like a streamer could afford, is what I would do is maybe invest in one of those spider color
Yeah.
things, right? So
Yeah.
you can buy those, editors use them, they put them on the monitor, they go through a program and it calibrates the monitor. So, you know, if you can't afford that expensive reference monitor, get a good, you know, computer monitor, get one of those tools, have that monitor calibrated so that your skin tone is correct. Because if I just went by monitors, I have my monitor here, I have my camera monitor, and I have my vmix over there, and I am three different colors in all three of those monitors.
Yeah.
So you can't use monitors. That's why you need to use the vector scope. And the ability to that input in your vector scope to go through your sources too, right? So that's the other thing. We'll have a router panel in front of us, or the RCPs. If you touch the hats of the RCPs, um, it will change the signal going into the reference monitor and the scope, you know. So you get camera one set, and then what you're going to do is you're going to bounce back and forth between your scope and in your scope and your reference monitor, between camera one and two, 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 and you're going to look at that blob, right? And you're going to see that blob on the vector scope move. And so if you have your camera one where you want it, you want to get those blobs on two by painting red and blue to match up. So when you go back and forth, you know,
Should stay the same.
it's a minor shift, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah. Another thing that's helpful that I learned, and this is in the let me pull back up the RC the RC. Oh, I went back. Let me pull back up the RCP. So on the Iris, so if you have a full-size RCP, or depending on your controls, you know, I'm not real familiar with the Colorfly on how you can do that, but um, I'll have a coarse. There's like it depends. Sony is coarse and sensitivity levels, right? Okay, so with this, you can adjust kind of the limits of that stick, right? So if I have that stick all the way up, it would open up the iris all the way, right? You know, maybe a 1.8, right? If I bring it all the way down, it'll close the iris. It'll literally cap the camera, right? But through the coarse adjustment and the sensitivity, I can set it so that when I bring it all the way down, it doesn't cap it. Maybe it goes to an f22, right? And when I say f22, that's the f-stops of the camera, right? So the smaller the number, a 1.8, it seems weird. That means the iris is all the way open. It's bringing in as much light as possible. When I say f22, the iris is closed as tight as possible. It's bringing in the least amount of light, right? And that's how you adjust the iris. You know, it bigger or open it, just like your pupils, right? So for something like sports, right, especially hockey, right, because the lighting is never changing, right? We use that coarse adjustment so that we can slam those sticks down to the bottom stop, and then that's the perfect level for ice, right? So when there's a whistle and that camera goes diving into fans, or even on the benches, because the drop off of light on the benches is so great, when they dive in there and then they come back out ready for game, I can iris it up and then just slam it down, and then it's going to be at the correct iris setting because I adjusted the course setting so that the backstop is the correct iris setting for the ice level, right? So you
That's a
can do
great
that.
tip. That is a
Yes.
really great tip. Yeah.
You could do that for, you know, outside sports too. It's just you're going to, as the night goes on, it gets darker, you're
Make
going
the
to have to
change.
adjust.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're going to have to adjust your course setting so that your stop, you know, changes too. But that's a really helpful tool.
And that's the kind of little things that, you know, when you're doing it all the time, like you are, that you just pick up, and it's great to be able to share things like that. I have a question from Andrew, who's traveling, I believe. Andrew wants to know, what's the name of your female V1 mentor?
Diana Caputa. So Ray and Diana, they're a husband and wife team. So they did golf for years. You know, if anybody's been in the business and worked big truck shows, either PGA golf or NFL football or even the World Series for Fox, and they also did some NASCAR. They're familiar. They kind of come as a pair. Ray came up in video, but then he transitioned into tech managing. So he even did some tech managing for golf. And then Diane came up through. She started, through utility and camera, and Ray was, utility and camera. And then she came up through and became a V1. So for the home show, Ray is our tech manager, and then she's the V1, and she is awesome. She's extremely knowledgeable. I'm very lucky to be learning from her.
Hey, it's a big thumbs up. Yeah, I want to have a question for you. You mentioned vMix as a software alternative to traditional hardware. Have you messed around with, like, is it Nobe? I believe it's called NOBE. They have a virtual vector scope, scopes and everything. Uh, we actually played around with that and came pretty close to what we needed with it. It was pretty impressive. And the other is our one trick we have. I'll go ahead and tell one trick we did too. Is we have a Sienna processing engine on site with us in our trucks, and so we were able to take every single input, and we were able to make a multi-viewer with, this is a source, this is what it looks like, and then right below that another window that had the way just a waveform on it. So at a glance you could look across all the inputs all at once, and you know where every one of those inputs is, and if one of them's like slammed to the top, well, hey, I need to adjust that a little bit more. That was a really cool workflow for us, and that was on 12 different cameras, so we filled up a pretty large multi-viewer like that for space. But that was something that worked out really well, and that's their software. I'm not sure how accurate, I'll be honest with you, how accurate the Sienna processing engine was in its vector scope, but there is a vector scope and waveform there. I'd like to put it through some more paces alongside a leader, just to know this is truly our point of reference and stuff. But I just didn't know if there was, I know you, because we first met back in TriCaster days. So where do you find the TriCaster's scopes are, because it has waveform and vector scope there. Where do you find
Yeah,
those in
yeah,
comparison?
I don't think they're bad. I think that I would consider them, a VMix level.
I like that they at least have markings on them. That's one thing that bugs me
Yes,
about vMix. There's no reference table or chart or anything like that on
yes. So the VMix vector scope is nice because it has
that
that mark
diagonal.
between the yellow and the red for facial tones. But the waveform is almost pointless because there is no markings. You have to look at it and then count, okay, 100, 90, 80, to see,
Right.
kind of where you're at. So yes, having something that has, the markings, big scopes, we can actually put in a marker, right? So
Oh,
we can
okay.
adjust the line. So like a leader scope, you can put in a line and you can say, I want that line to be blue, right? So you can tell the color, and then you can put it where you want it, right? So for like hockey, we run the hockey, generally the ice at 90 on a waveform, right? So we have that line at blue so that we can just look, okay, yep, it's hitting the blue. We're at
Gotcha.
correct iris for the ice.
Makes sense. That makes total sense. Little tricks and trade. So if you ever used one thing, whenever Andrew Cross came out with this in the TriCaster, was the 3D or full color scope. Do you find, or is anything else doing that? That full color scope threw me off. And I'm just
Yeah,
used to the single color from the old analog days.
yeah, no, um, you know, I'll show you here. Um, so this is a lot of the new trucks are having this Prism, and it's from Telestream. And if the name sounds familiar, right, they do Wirecast.
Wirecast, yeah.
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 So they have really good scopes. And so what you see here, you see like underneath that picture, you see red, green, and blue. Well, that's a waveform, but it's a waveform showing red, green, blue, right?
Right.
So we will use that a lot to balance colors. But really, the tools are, you know, the waveform, and there's some different, you know, settings here. There's you know, the RGB, you know, waveform. There's the YPBR waveform, you know, and then there's, you know, gain and black. So there's different settings. So the RGB or the YRGB are becoming more and more popular for V1s and V2s to use to balance out. I did a small truck show that was swimming and diving, and frankly, I relied on that a lot because they didn't really have really good scopes. My vector scope was kind of useless, and so I used that really to try to balance out the cameras.
Mhm.
And then a really another really important one that's come along, and not a lot of scopes have it, is what's called the double diamond. And so over here, this is a traditional double diamond here, and so it's a different way of showing the vectors. Um, so and that's really good because it's kind of like if you have those spikes kind of going straight up and down, you're kind of more into your correct white balance there. So a lot of people are using the double diamonds, but a lot of scopes don't use those. It For the longest time, I think it was only a Tektronix was the only scopes that had the double diamonds in it. But the Telestreams, the new Telestreams, have the double diamonds.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't actually heard of that Prism system. I'm going to look into that a little closer at NAB. I'm looking forward to that. Eric Boyer asks if you drop a small Marshall cam into a AGA frame sync, for instance, and you use its proc amps to paint, are there limitations there? Comparing that to a real system, you know, compared to a real system, of course, there's some limitations versus being able to paint that unit itself. Now, I know there are ways of painting Marshalls. They have their little baby RCPs, I guess we would call it. Hey, look, yeah, Greg's got one. He's holding up. Say something, Greg, so you pop up.
Hello, here I is.
Yep.
This is one of their RCPs.
And that's over 422. Is that right? Serial
485.
485. Okay, I knew it was serial. So it's connecting over serial, which means cable issues and long runs and things like that a little bit. What about, and as Eric's question is like, compared to a real system, as one step down, would it be better to run the limit, or are there more limitations going into vMix with that Marshall camera, or would you still have more control going into an AJ frame sync?
Yeah, I mean, you know, AJ
Or is
frame
the
syncs.
real
Yeah,
goal paint the camera itself? That's my goal, is buy
yes,
the
the
camera that you
real
can paint yourself. So use Greg's solution.
Yeah, yes. The real goal would be to paint the camera itself, right? But you might not always have that option, right? So for baseball, all of our Marshall POVs we do have coming into a paint box from Marshall like that, right? It is a little tricky, right? Because you have to get it into the truck, right? We're using fiber to bring those in, so we're actually using Thor fiber units because Thor has fiber converters that have the ability to push the data down through it, right? So we're
Right.
pushing the data down the fiber with the video signal, and then we're able to get that into the truck. But that's not always the case, right? So then the kind of the next level is a high-end frame sync and an AJA. The Black Magic, I forget, what do they call them, the Tele whatever,
Teradex.
the
Teradex.
Teradexes, they're not bad. I've been on some trucks with them. They actually do a pretty good job too. So the next level would be that. And what I would do is, you know, set that camera up, take out a test monitor. This is my best friend, is my test monitor.
What model is that? Hold that back
This
up again.
is the Troubleshooter Mini. Um, So this is about $900.
Oh, it's
But
not too bad.
this has saved my butt so much because it can do so much. It can take SDI in, it does SDI out, it does HDMI in, it does HDMI out. It will down and cross convert just like a decimator, but then it has generators on it. So I can generate pathologicals, I can generate color bars with a moving box, I can test cables with it, I can see jitter, I can see the signal. It has some vector scopes and stuff like this. So this is a video person's best friend, because when you're going out, you know, you might have to push a signal back to the truck to see, is it the cable, is it the camera? I put this on the cable and I know if that pops up, then it's not the cable, it's the camera. So having a good test monitor. So if you have a Marshall, I would take a monitor out, right? Set it up, just get it painted through the controls locally, you know, with a test monitor, you know, do an auto white balance and then lock it, right? Lock it, because you don't want it to be fluctuating on its own. Then put it into a frame sync and then use the proc amp. If you can afford an AJA, great. If you can afford a Blackmagic, great. If you're down to, you know, vMix, then, you know, that's fine.
So would you say that the software, say vMix, their proc amps, not as controllable or not as flexible as the AJs? You still have more
No,
control with AJ?
yeah. I mean, you have a lot of control, but AJA's processing is just so much better. You know, I mean, you look at an FS4, I think it's around
Right.
$9,000, right?
Yeah.
You
But
know,
that's 4
so
channels though, right?
it is 4 channels.
Oh,
In 1080.
Yeah. So you can, you know, and the beauty of that is it also inputs, you know, you can put an SPF card and you can bring in fiber that way, right? So you can actually use an AJA frame sync. If you're building your own fiber boxes with rattlers out in the field, you could use an AJA frame sync 4 as the receiver, right? So if you have camcorders out in the field, you're converting it with like a Rattler and a Pelican, and you're pushing it back fiber, you can bring it into that FS4 through fiber, and then that's your converter back to SDI, and then you have a proc amp there. So you almost have like a poor man's RCP, right?
at that
Team
point.
that up with
Sure.
a Colorfly or something like that, and you have some poor man's RCP. But, you know, the good news is all these cameras are getting better and better. The JVC 500 I have sitting in front of me, right? I hook that up to a network. I can bring it back and I can get full control of that camera, right? So I can paint it. I
Web
can paint
page
it
interface,
wirelessly.
not
Yeah,
software, web page
web
interface,
page
right?
interface
Right.
through
Okay.
software, or there are controllers.
Oh,
Scarhoy has a white labeled controller for JVC
that's right.
to RCP, the 500s, and their big boy, which I forget the model. So a lot of cameras, you know, the new Canons, like the 605s, any modern cameras are having those web interfaces and GUIs that you can paint them. So really, you just need a network connection, really, to
Yeah.
get that signal back to paint.
That was always a big thing that I was looking for in all our cameras because we were so far away in fiber. It was just necessary. And there was one time I had the HBX 370s, which our next question is regarding. I sold them to this sucker. I mean, Joe, a friend of mine, that I got out of those cameras because like they made their money's worth, but we're not using those cameras anymore. Joe's trying to make some life still out of them. And I sent him our data video pack. They have a MCU 100 that uses Cat 5 in a point-to-point basis. So it's not using network, but it's point-to-point. And so it's running that serial, that 422 over it. So Greg, this might be a question for you too, Doug. You're definitely welcome to answer it too. 422 over fiber, because Joe needs to go those long distance now. Are there adapter boxes that you suggest to be able to run that? Is Thor one to look for? And putting those ends up, Greg, any ideas there too?
So I use Moxa makes a great selection of little serial to whatever converters. And I elected to go to Ethernet because all of my fiber boxes have a managed switch in it with multiple VLANs. So we typically have a Dante VLAN, an NDI VLAN, and what we could call control net, which is all the engineering, machine control. So that's where all the camera control ends up, is on that network. So just push that network out there, convert the serial to a network. The little boxes are like about $100. You need one on each end. Some
Oh,
of them will even talk one box at the truck to multiple boxes in the field over the network. So, and that gives you a serial point out there right by the camera.
Right.
So we've made up little looms to go to our marshals that have an SDI for the video. You come back to the fiber box and got a little barrel connector power for the camera power. And then there's either an XLR or just bare wires, because some of the Marshall cameras, I don't have one handy, have little like spring terminals on the back for the
Right.
serial
Right,
connection.
that's right.
But whatever it takes, so that's all in one little loom. So basically I'm pulling one camera or one cable from where the camera is back down to the fiber box. And once I get there, it's all done. And then there's inputs built in on the fiber box to take all of those signals. And then it all marries into a lot of the boxes will mux all of that into one single fiber core. So I can pull, cameras, monitors, data, serial, everything. I only need one strand. So,
I had a feeling you had a solution. So
so
I
that's
will
one way.
that I will definitely connect you up with Joe, because we've actually been looking for it. I haven't been looking really hard, I got to admit, Joe, but I gave that problem to you because that was what I hated about that system, was that it has little boxes that you put on the cameras and it plugs in through the Hyros connector on the camera for control, but then you had to run out Cat5, which could be up to 300 foot. That's great, but
Well,
still,
if it's serial, you could probably run
wasn't
it
as
a
fun.
lot further than that. I mean, I've run serial for RTS panels 1,000 feet,
Yeah,
and
well,
that's
they
basically the same
recommended
485.
300 foot
Right,
as a
right, right, right.
max.
But
Yeah.
serial's fairly robust. They also make other fiber boxes that are like the Moxes, except they convert to fiber. So you go serial box, fiber core, back to another box, and it reconstitutes the serial on the other end. Those worked really well. But in my opinion, burning a whole strand of glass for some really low bandwidth serial to control a iris, it's kind
Right.
of
Kind of a
not very
waste.
fiber
Yeah.
efficient. But hey, it's if that's what you got, it still works. You're still
Yeah. So we're
controlling
gonna
the
have to do
camera.
some engineering with his setup, because it's an RJ45. So we're gonna have to wire it RJ45
Yeah.
into these little boxes, and but at least I know there are some options out there. I just haven't looked too hard. The serial converters I had were used for radar guns, and so it was either 232 or 422, I believe.
Some of the Moxes will do all three.
Ah,
So there's a big terminal strip on the bottom of the Moxa that's got like 9 or 10 terminals. And if you want 232, you take these three: ground, up, transmit, and receive. If you want 422, you take these four. Here's a TX pair and an RX pair. If you want RS45, that's just these two, because all you need is one pair for that.
yeah, there we go. Yeah, so
So
we
lots of
just need to
options out
figure out
there.
the pin out of that cable then at
Mhm.
that point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, because he's I've helped him get into the whole IP world, and so that is one of the things that he's looking to convert it into IP to carry it back, because he's already there with his comms, he's already there with his video, his NDI, so it's definitely moving that. So another question from Eric, another sponsor coming up: 3 wireless Teradeks. Oh, this is a fun question because I just fought this. So outdoors, lots of changing lighting. Of course, you're gonna need to do it. Probably FX6s. Good luck, Eric. And in the best case scenario, frame syncs or vMix Pro Cam. Best case scenario, my suggestion is get control of those cameras. FX6s can be painted from Squirrelways. They have a module that does do that, and that would be the best. I personally just did this showdown in Delray, the tennis show, and we had one wireless camera that worked really well off of DJI wireless, and then at that point we were sending back to it TCP/IP over an access point. So the actual camera itself had a small little receiver that talk to our normal APs that we already have deployed anyway. And that's where we were talking to that camera directly to its IP address from our Skullhawk. And that worked fairly well. Of course, we were doing some really long days, and every once in a while we would have to scramble our channels because there's also some jokers there running other IPs, other access points, and they were blasting us. And so it took a couple of days to get it sorted out with who was going to get what bandwidth. But that was a good solution for us. Doug, what is your go-to on the trucks for painting those wireless camera solutions?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the trucks, our wireless rigs has a dedicated wireless control also. So besides sending the wireless video signal, there's a separate unit that is sending a wireless signal that we have control. But you've hit the key, and that's the beauty of all these modern cameras is they're all controllable via network, right? So it's just a matter of getting a network signal. And is that putting up an access point with a high gain antenna up real high that you can get a signal? Or I haven't played with it, but Hollyland's like big SOCOM wireless system, it pushes Ethernet. So on the back that plugs into the camera, you can plug in video and it has Ethernet in there.
This is their
So
wireless video system?
their wireless video thing, their big boy. I think it's the SOCOM, or I can't remember the name, but Hollyland's like top of the line wireless signal. It has an Ethernet jack on there, so
Syscom is what
you would have the ability to network connect wirelessly through that to the cameras. Now, the only drawback is apparently you can't change the IP address of the master station, right? So it's going to be on that IP address. So you would have to run a network for that. So like if you're running, like for me with streaming with my routers, I want run a non-traditional network, like 40.40.40. Whatever, or something like that.
Of course, it's probably default as 192.168.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so that it'll conflict with every other router and thing out there, to have an issue. So you would have to probably have a standalone network, just for your camera control, but it does have that ability in it.
Well,
It says it supports 422 and 485 down that same pipe too.
That's
so,
also too, yes.
So yeah, a lot of cameras are still backwards compatible with that, even if they do Ethernet. So
yeah, that's good to know. And I would say for sure start looking, Eric, in that world of a dedicated IP address that or a dedicated IP setup so that you can access those cameras directly if the worst case scenario. Put those little, I mean, that little box I bought was maybe $50 that I stuck on the back of the camera. So it was very inexpensive. And I just did it to try it. And it worked well enough that we were using we weren't using the Peplink APs. I think we're using our high output long range Unify, which I do say that the Unify radios, they tend to punch through a lot of stuff. That's the only Unify thing I have left. I have a stack of Unify switches that are not in service, but that's the only Unify thing I have. And I had one of their big boy. They have a stadium access point that's about yay big, and it is just like a bazooka of energy going out. And I had one of those one time that I set up, and the range on it was amazing. Of course, you flood everybody in that whole area with just so much RF energy of your band, to make sure you're in your band. But that was one of the things that we were fighting, was because we were working with other teams there. They had one of those two radios. They had two different radios up, one on either end of the courts. And one of them was so wide, it was set like 40 megahertz wide or 80 megahertz, maybe even. And so it was just taking up so much space, and it was just a backup, but they were flooding out the channels, the Wi-Fi channels. And then you have to be careful and be able, if you control the area, great. I didn't actually control the area. We didn't have an RF coordinator. I actually requested it next year. It's like, we need an RF coordinator, or, hey, we volunteer to be the person in charge, but you're going to have to listen to us, because there was 4 different production networks going on for 4 different vendors. And some of them were just a standalone Netgear router or Linksys router or something like that. It just had some ears on it. But others, they were using real APs, and they were pushing just way too much energy in the area. So just things to think about, Eric, when you're working on that project.
And that's to piggyback on it, that's why, for the low end streamer, everybody wants to do the wireless because it's easy, right? I don't have to run cameras, blah 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 blah. And I always push people away from that because you pay for what you get in a wireless signal. So unless you're getting ready to spend out a $10,000 system, and there's so much in the bandwidth. I mean, Greg knows how much has the bandwidth been shrunk on wireless mics, right?
Yeah.
We're down
Very.
to a sliver. There is so much out there. The NFL, when I work NFL games, they have a dedicated team that has a sniffer, and it's going out and it's finding any illegal signal and shutting it down. And all those things, like you said, are coordinated. So you're out there, and unless your high school games are in the boondocks. I have some people I work with. They're doing a high school game in the boondock, right? But then there's a game in downtown Pittsburgh, and they come in and they're like, none of my stuff works. I'm like, yeah, it's probably not going to, because you're in downtown Pittsburgh, and there's television stations, radio stations, hospitals, securities, with radios and stuff like that. It's just flooding that band, and you're crushed.
Yeah. Agreed.
Hey,
Well,
Jeff, just it's real quick.
Yep.
When you were just saying that these devices flood the network, are you talking about control in like the 2.4 land, or is it
Oh,
somewhere
yeah.
else in the band?
The access points they had up are flooding. They had their channels set probably to default, or somebody didn't know what they were doing, and so they had their band was just way too wide. It didn't need to be that wide,
Mhm.
and they were covering like on the top side of the 2.4, and they were also broadcasting in 5 gigahertz. So it didn't matter. Brandon was bouncing back and forth between them trying to find
Mhm.
it. Finally, he found out who had that, and he was like, can we make some adjustments? He goes, yeah, I just plug it in.
Yes, right.
That's probably one of them, is like they probably just didn't know better, and I wouldn't say they were being belligerent about it, but we all try to work together, right, when we're on show sites.
Right. We don't take wireless for granted, but yeah, they don't even think about it.
Yeah,
Good point.
exactly. Yeah. What was really funny is one of their radios was like right next to the audio transmission, audio wireless system. And I mean, when I say right next to, I'm like, it was here and here. and they were worried. It's like, we can't get our wireless stuff to stay reliable. I'm like, really? You think? It was like, you got that much energy right there, and they're both in the 2.4 range. Like, yeah, maybe move that antenna out this way. And then he finds out his external antennas were laying on their side. Somebody it was blocking their vision, so they went ahead and moved them, get them out of the way. So okay, here's a good question from Sky. Great to hear from you, Sky. Is there a depth of field issue with broadcast Fuji 9 lenses? Do I need to worry about a grain in a 1.8 f-stop?
No, you shouldn't. I mean, if we're, for E&G lenses, B4 mount lenses, those are, parafocal lenses, which means they hold their focus. So, wide open, you shouldn't really see the grain. The grain happens when in the camera, when you start inducing gain, right? So you really shouldn't see any grain, but it really becomes the camera and how the camera's processing the signal, because the lens, if it's a detachable lens, or even on a camcorder, the glass is the glass, right? I once saw a Fujinon person, somebody say to him like, hey, like all these electronics are getting cheaper and cheaper and the lenses are still very expensive, and he said, polishing glass is polishing glass. It hasn't changed for 1,000 years. So that's why, you could get a camera head, for $6,000, but then you're shelling out $100,000 for a box lens, right? And you could get a good picture, like, like the Sony, FX9s and stuff like that. The heads themselves aren't that really expensive, but you're going to, shell out the money on the glass. So you really shouldn't see any grain or a depth of field issue with that. Speaking of depth of field, a lot of everybody wants the shallow depth of field, right? Which is kind of funny. But one way with a camcorder, if you're shooting talent or an E&G camera, one trick that we will do is we will dial in an ND, right? So we will dial in an ND even though we don't have to, so that we can push that iris up closer to an f2 or an f3, and then that will soften the background. Because if you have that iris with the talent, you know, at a f4 and an f5, that background's going to be very sharp and crisp, right? But if you pop in an ND, you know, and then you're going to have to open up your iris, you're going to create a depth of field, and you're going to soften it for your talent, for a talent shot, right? So that's a trick to use. And
Now,
then
you would use that on talent, but you have control of where that talent's standing.
yes,
I had somebody last year, Lord, I love him. Omar was helping us shading cameras, and he was using that trick because he was used to doing corporate events, and it threw our camera operators for an absolute loop because their focal length went from here to like here.
yeah,
And and it made it too hard for them to be able to follow a player moving back and forth at the speed that we're moving, because they were having to chase focus, and it upset my director a little bit. And nobody likes an upset Dwayne. So we finally figured out, okay, well, that's the reason why, is because he was doing that. And now it makes perfect sense, because well, we do this all the time in corporate events. I'm like, but they're not moving anywhere. They're not moving this way anywhere. So
yes.
be wary of using that trick, because it doesn't work in all situations, especially
Yes, you use that trick when you're shooting the talent, and then when you're done shooting the talent, you take that ND off.
There we go.
You know,
There we go.
and so you know, and if we're talking correct, you know, so the kind of the uneducated, right? So the, you know, if you're at an F10, right, your focal depth might be like this, right? So if the head's here or the head's there, it's going to be in focus no matter what, right? And as you close that iris, it's going to get more, so that when that head goes over to here, it's out of focus, and then it's in focus. And that's a big challenge for streamers, because high school fields and stuff like that, you know, at night are never lit properly, right? You're
True.
probably
Very true.
you're
Very
probably
true.
down, you know, on your iris. So there's a couple things you could do. Normally in sports, we don't run shutter, right? We turn the shutter off, right? But for high school, if I'm on a small truck show, I might turn shutter on so that I can try to gain an f-stop for my camera guys, right? I
Mhm.
might sacrifice and put in gain and risk some grain, because like you have to say to yourself, what's better, having a slightly grainy picture, or having a camera guy always out of focus and racking the focus as they're trying to follow the player on a tight shot, right?
Very
I
true.
rather have a little bit of grain and sacrifice the quality of the picture to have it in focus, you know? So you have to be mindful for your camera operators where you're running. You also don't want to run at like an f16. So if you want to run at the top end, maybe an f10, right? So if you're at an f12 or whatever, you should probably be putting ND in. If the ND is too much, then you put in negative gain, right? You can use negative gain to then adjust it, right?
Okay. But that's one of the things, you know, talking about the tricks of the trade. You recently, we had a little conversation about this, that you had the adventure of using Blackmagic camera chains on a show. So
Yeah.
that adventure, tell us a little bit about the challenges in that adventure, because there are people out there, well, I'm not one of them, but there are people out there that swear they're the best thing, and they're the since sliced bread, they're the perfect solution, because you know they're the part of the Blackmagic ecosystem. So what did you run into in a V2 position, or V1? You were V1 on that truck, right? So in
Yeah.
that position, what did you run into as limitations, so that other people that see this understand these are the limitations in those chains
Yeah, so the biggest thing I found out is you can't turn off the shutter.
at
There's no
all?
way. There's no way from the RCP, and I had my camera guys check, and I looked. There is no way from the head, it seems, to turn off the shutter. Now, before I get yelled at from Blackmagic fans, maybe those cameras that was the first time I've worked with those cameras, maybe I don't know what software version they were on. Maybe a later software version has that ability, but I couldn't turn off the shutters. You know, the RCPs, I had a hard time getting all the controls of it, but the biggest kind of headache other than the shutter was the handshake, right? So we were doing a situation where we had multiple drops. So we were moving the cameras from one setup to another setup depending on what we were covering. And so when we would unplug and restab, sometimes it fired up, sometimes that handshake with the fiber didn't fire up, right? I'd have green lights. It said, hey, we're good, but I wasn't getting anything. So we'd have to unstab it, restab it, let it go through the process. So
were you sucking power on the RCPs, or I'm sorry, on the CCUs every time? Or because from what I understand, the Blackmagic doesn't use high voltage like our Panasonics or Sony's do. It's a lower voltage, maybe 48. I'm not sure on what it's using across the SMPTE, but are you powering down the CCUs when you do that, or are you pulling them and telling them to walk it to the next?
Really just pulling them and walking to the next on the Blackmagics. I mean, we're used to that with the with our broadcast cameras. So if our Triax or even the SMPTE hybrid cameras like the Grass Valley and the Sonys, we'll have multiple drops.
Gotcha.
For
and those
for
are going
handhelds.
into CCUs that are already powered up.
Yeah, they're going through CCUs that are always powered up. A lot of times if the truck is even laying in overnight, the CCUs won't power down. We'll power down the cameras from the CCUs, or if we're using sheds, meaning we don't have the SMPTE fiber in the building, and so they're using a shed to go from ST fiber to SMPTE hybrid fiber, and they're plugging that in locally. They'll unplug that locally so that they power down the camera. The Triaxes, we can power them down from the RCPs. So we'll leave the CCUs. We'll unplug and unstab and leave the CCUs. With the Blackmagics, sometimes we did have to power cycle the actual CCU on the Blackmagics. I was on a truck that I had a little truck that has the older version, the ATEM camera controls, the little battery powered boxes, those things, with the LC fiber, those never like to do the handshake too. And that was always a problem because you'd have to shut down, you'd have one camera that wasn't popping up, but you'd have to shut down the whole receiver to repower cycle it. And then you're like, oh, I hope all four come up this time. And then like the one you had a issue one comes up, and then two that you didn't have an issue doesn't come up. And you're like, okay, let me power cycle it again. And it's just all about that handshake.
Whether or not it's getting sync. I remember those times. I used to use those wonderful pieces of hardware. So is there anything else that you could think of, like, besides you've already dropped some great nuggets? Is there anything else you could think of that would be, oh yeah, this is the best trick I've ever been taught from, say, your mentor or anybody else when shading cameras? What is the number one trick that you feel like this makes it easier?
Probably that what I told you about is setting your limits to on the backstop for your correct iris for the field, because the longest time I was like, I want full control. I want full control. I want full control, and then they're like, what are you doing it? Just set the limit. I'm like, but what if and they were like, how's it ever going to get brighter? Like it's lidded. How's it ever get brighter? And if it does, just down the gain. You could quickly down the gain, especially with our Grass Valleys. We have a top hat that is a spin wheel, so we can dial down the gain just like an iris, so we control those. So that's a good tip. And then along with it, I'll share one of my most embarrassing moments. This was early on in the big truck. I was a V2. And the V2 for Pirates have the two robo cams, the mid-home robo, and then the splash cam, which at PNC Park is high up in the stands, and it's to get those home runs that are going off into the river, right? That's why it's the splash cam, right? Okay. So it was dark. We had Cruz, it was his first year. Heavy hitter, right? Everybody was waiting for him to hit one into the river, right? He was getting closer and closer and closer, right? So it was nighttime. Diana said, you should run those in auto. And I'm like, oh, I'm not going to run those in auto because that's not what a V1 does. I'm going to control the sticks, right? Right. So here comes Cruz and hits a home run, and I'm busy doing other stuff. And I just hear her going, splash, 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 because the ball falls it down and it just goes into a dark hole because it was irised for
The
inside the
lighting on her
park.
side.
And when
not
it
the
went in,
outside.
it was a
Oh.
black hole. And she was like, and that's why we run iris. So that clip was played like a billion times of that ball going into the river, and it just went into like a black hole.
Mm. Yeah, we've had those too.
Yeah. So know your tools,
Sure.
and when to use them, right? We as professionals go, no, we would never use auto iris, but you know what? It's a tool, and sometimes you have to use it in certain situations. So it really is knowing your limitations of your gear and your tools and what you can get out of it.
Absolutely. Man, this has been fantastic. Doug, I'm so glad that you were available. Appreciate all your pre-prep and everything like that. This has been a great show. I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions, and we'll probably have you back again another time to talk, because this is all about us that have been in it a while, and trying to bring this information out to the people that are coming up. And we really appreciate everybody that's jumped in and contributed. Thank you, Greg, for your information. JJ, Andy, Guy, thank you all for all that information. And it really is helpful to be able to share this in a medium that we can actually learn from. And we look forward to the next one. Next week, I don't have anything planned in big splash or anything like that, so I'm still working on what subject's going to be next week. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now, and we will get this posted up on YouTube shortly for everybody else to enjoy.